So let's talk about the Constitutional Convention, which is held in 1787 in Philadelphia. The express purpose of the Constitutional Convention was to revise the articles, not wipe them out, not start off with a new document, but to make whatever changes were necessary to make the articles more efficient. Now, this time, as opposed to the Annapolis Convention, when only 5 of 13 states shows up, they do actually better this time. They get 12 of 13 states show up. The only state that doesn't show up is Rhode Island. Now, roughly, and I say roughly because books will sometimes differ, 74 delegates are appointed to attend the convention, but only about 55 make it. The others don't make it for business reasons, family reasons, whatever. And then the average daily attendance is about 30. 30 people show up every day for the meetings. And it's held in the same hall as they declared independence in. Now, it's the educated people that are showing up here. It's the wealthier farmers, the businessmen that are showing up, the intellectual leaders that are showing up at this convention. It also tends to be a younger group, the average age being 42, with the oldest person being Ben Franklin at 81 and a man named Dayton out of New Jersey who was 26. Now you may be thinking that 42 doesn't seem young, especially with life expectancy as it was back then, but life expectancy included infant mortality rate and people who died in their teens. But if you could get to 21, you could live into your 60s. So it's a very elite group of people here, and it's led at least one historian in the late 1800s, Charles Beard, to argue that these people really weren't interested in democracy or a republic, but maintaining their own economic interests when they created this Constitution. Most historians don't necessarily buy that today. So let's talk about who's at the convention and who's not. We won't hit everybody, but we'll get a few. Obviously, George Washington is there. They've convinced George Washington, who had retired after the American Revolution, which was considered pretty unique. Usually when you were a general and you'd won a war, you expected political power. Washington in 1783 had turned in his sword and said, hey, my family dies pretty young. I'm probably going back to Mount Vernon. I'll be dead soon. But they're able to convince him to come back down for this convention, lend his gravitas to it. He's going to be the guy that's preside over the convention. He doesn't say a lot, but he presides over the convention. So he's there. Alexander Hamilton's there. Now, Hamilton is a brilliant man. He's an immigrant. He'd come from the West Indies. He had worked his way up very fast as to being one of George Washington's most trusted aides in the war. But Hamilton is not liked. He's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But he's also very, very arrogant. He knows he's brilliant. He doesn't mind showing off that he's brilliant. And so other people don't like him for that. He can make you feel stupid. And they also make fun of him because his parents never married, therefore he was considered illegitimate. But he's there. He is sort of the visionary because he doesn't belong to a particular group. He's not part of the Northeast, the New England colonies. He's not part of the middle colonies. He's part of the southern colonies. He's from outside. He's an immigrant. And he looks at America as something that can be really great if we could put aside these differences and have maybe a stronger central government. Also, there's James Madison, sometimes known as the father of the Constitution. Madison is a very soft-spoken individual. He's often told to speak up during the convention. He wears black a lot. He's wearing black because he was in mourning because he had broken up with his fiance. But it's Madison's ideas that really shaped the Constitution. He's very well read, and that's why he's often known as the father of the Constitution. Also there is James Wilson, one of the nation's top attorneys, Roger Sherman from Connecticut, who's great at getting people to compromise. We've already mentioned Ben Franklin, John Dickinson, the man who wrote Letters of a Pennsylvania Farmer during the Revolution. And then there was Luther Martin out of Maryland. Luther Martin's a very active states' rights person. So a very eclectic group here. Now, there are some people that are not here that we should mention. One of them is going to be Thomas Jefferson. He's the ambassador to France right now, so he's not around. The other one is John Adams, who's the ambassador of England, so he's not around. And then there's a group that the late Pauline Mary once referred to as the old revolutionaries, the people that got the revolution started. And that includes people like John Hancock, Samuel Adams, and Patrick Henry. These people had got the American Revolution going and got America's independence. And now you're seeing a younger group led by Madison and Hamilton and others who are saying, thanks, old guys, for getting us independent, but your system of government's not working, and we're going to try to change it. So it's a revolution again, but this time fought with words, not bullets. And these old revolutionaries will not attend. Patrick Henry makes the comment, he smells a rat. So those are some people who are there or not there. Obviously, there are many others. But early on, they make some monumentous decisions, right? They're going to make Washington the president of the convention. They decide that they are going to throw away the articles. They just decide they're not going to work. They're going to scrap the articles. They weren't there to do that. They were there to revise the articles, but now they're going to throw them away, which is going to cause some controversy later on. And they decide that they're going to keep the meeting a secret. It's a secret, not because they're involved in a conspiracy or they're the Illuminati or they're space aliens or anything like that. Is what they wanted was they wanted everybody at this convention to be able to speak their mind freely without being criticized in the press back home. So if you had an idea, throw it out there. No one's going to hold it against you. And they do a very good job of keeping it secret. Nothing leaks out. What we know about the convention comes from James Madison's diaries, detailed diaries published after his death around 1841. But it's interesting to note that using modern technology, we can see that, that Madison had actually changed his diary over years. So even when you're looking at primary source documents like a diary, that person who writes the diary obviously has an agenda, right? They want to make themselves look good, their political opponents not so good. And maybe they have a falling out with somebody and go back and change parts of their diary. It's possible. And so we've always got to be suspicious of those things. Now, if they're going to get rid of the Constitution or the Articles of Confederation, they need some plans. The first plan, and we're summing up here, it's a very brief summary of this. We can go much more detail in your book, but it's just a brief summary. The first plan is known as the Virginia Plan. Now, it's the work of James Madison, but not introduced by him. And it argued for a bicameral legislature, a two-house legislature, with representation based on population in both houses. The people would elect the lower house, people being the landowners. It was a very small percentage of actual people. It did include women or people of color. And then the lower house would elect the upper house. And each house, again, would have representation based on population. This would tend to favor the larger states. And strangely enough, Virginia was the largest state in the Union at the time. It would also create an independent president or executive branch, an independent judicial branch, and give the national government additional powers to regulate trade and so on. Now, the other plan is the New Jersey plan introduced by William Patterson, and it's closer to what they were supposed to do in the first place. What they were supposed to do in the first place, obviously, was to revise the Articles. And that's what this does. It calls for a unicameral legislature, just like the Articles, each state getting one vote, just like the Articles. But they would give the national government some additional powers, and especially dealing with trade and some taxation. So it's really a revision of the Articles. Well, as we can tell by today's system of government, they're going to use as their basic plan the Virginia plan. But there's a debate over the representation issue, right? Because the small states like New Jersey don't want to be swallowed up by the big states like Virginia or New York. And so there's a debate over representation, and they need some sort of compromise, and it better be a good compromise. No, it better be a great compromise. And they come up with a great compromise, or sometimes known as the Connecticut Compromise, because Roger Sherman had a lot to do with it. And so what does the Great Compromise says? It says, well, one, we'll create a bicameral legislature. The lower house will have representation based on population. They'd be elected by the people, not a whole lot of people. They'd serve a brief 2-year term. And then you'd have an upper house called the Senate, where each state would get 2 senators, and they would be selected by state legislatures serving 6-year terms. Now, you don't get to vote for your senators until the 20th century and the passage of the 17th Amendment. And by the way, there are people like Rick Perry who argues that you should get rid of the 17th Amendment and again go back to what the founders wanted and having the state legislatures pick senators on the argument that senators were designed not to represent the people, but the interests of the state government. Well, anyway, so when you look at the House and Senate, why 2 years versus 6 years? They assume that the House would be a fairly radical body because you're being elected every 2 years, which means you have to pay close attention to public opinion, and therefore it's going to be a much more rash, emotional body. But in the Senate, you got 6 years, and so you're insulated by that long time period that you can make decisions that are more thoughtful and time. You have time to really think them through, and so it insulates you from public opinion. And I'll just give you this example because this was recently in Texas. We had the big debate about Ted Cruz wanting to go off to Cancun during the big snowvid 2021, the big snow crisis. And people have asked me, they go, is this going to affect his reelection campaign? And I said, well, he's not up for reelection for 4 years. 4 years from now is a lifetime in politics. Things change, right? He might do something that's incredibly great or whatever, or bad, who knows? But that's the idea of the Senate, is that you have this long time period so that you have the ability to make or do controversial things, and the public tends to forget about it. Now, the problem we face here is that if you're going to have representation based on population in the House, that means you're going to have to do a census. You're going to have to count everybody. And the question is, who do you count? Obviously, you count white men, according to these fellows, and you count their families, but do you count slaves? Well, Southern states said no. Well, rephrase that. Southern states said yes. Wow, that was a complete rephrasing. And the reason Southern states said yes was because they were fearful that this new government would be dominated by Northerners and might eventually abolish slavery. And if you're a state like South Carolina, for example, you are majority slave. You're 60% slave. If you're a northern state, you say no. You say, look, wait a minute. You don't treat enslaved people as anything but property. They have no other rights. Why would you want to count them? And so they come up with what they call the 3/5 compromise, in which slaves would count, or enslaved people would count, as 3/5 of a person for representation and tax purposes. This is going to give the South more representation in Congress than they probably deserve compared to the North. And this is going to have an impact on some other issues later as well. As part of this great compromise, they also agreed to ban the importation of slaves after 1808. Now, that didn't stop people. Historians think between 1808 and 1860, the beginning of the Civil War, that probably 600,000 people were enslaved in this country illegally by people like Jim Bowie, strangely enough. He was an illegal slave trader. All right, so there is the legislative branch. Now let's talk about an executive branch. Now the executive branch, there was some talk of maybe having more than one executive, right? Being able to elect several different people to run branches, like elect the president, elect the vice president, elect the secretary of war, elect the secretary of treasury, thus spreading out power and weakening the government. There would be no one person with a lot of power. That's sometimes known as a plural executive, which is exactly what we use in Texas. Our Texas governor is a weak governor because we elect the lieutenant governor, the comptroller, the attorney general, the railroad commission. We elect all those different people. And so the governor's power is weakened by that. Well, that doesn't go anywhere. So then they decide on a single executive. There was some brief talk about having a single executive serving a 6-year term, and that's it. Which, by the way, is still a talk out there. There's some people who think that would be a great idea because then the president would not be beholden to trying to run for re-election. He'd spend 6 years focused on what he's going to do for the country. But they decided to go on a single executive serving a 4-year term. Now, they're very careful about this because they don't like giving anybody too much power, because they're afraid that if you give somebody too much power, that they'll become a dictator. Now, you don't want to say that at the convention because everybody knows who the first president's going to be. It's going to be George Washington. And you don't want to call George Washington a dictator, right? So you tiptoe around that. And so the idea was that you'd have a president serving a fixed term, 4 years. There'd be no limit on it. There's no limit on running for the presidency until 1951. You can serve as many as you want, but Washington will start the 2-term limit, and that the president would be elected indirectly through an electoral college. The reason you have an electoral college is because often that the founders feared that you, the people, shouldn't be trusted, that you would elect some idiot, say like me, as president, and you wouldn't want to do that, right? And so the way the Electoral College votes is that you'd have the same number of electoral votes for your state as you do as number of senators and representatives. So each state would have at least 3, right? If you had 1 representative, 2 senators, that's the minimum you could have. They thought actually what would happen is that the electors would never be able to get anybody who had a majority of the vote Electoral College, and the vote would go to the House, and the House would often pick the presidency. They thought that would be a better way of going. I think probably the founders would be shocked about how we do things today. Probably be shocked about a lot of things we do today. But that was 1790, and applying 1790 to the 21st century, fairly problematic, I would think. Well, so here's the thing. If you get electoral college votes equal to the number of representatives and senators you have, then this means that the southern states, because of the 3/5 compromise, get more representatives. And if you were to go back and look for the first 50 years or 60 years of the presidency in the United States, it's dominated by Southerners. And that's partly because of the 3/5 compromise. It's not until the 1850s when they start abandoning the idea of balancing free states and slave states that you start seeing more Northerners get elected to the presidency. I mean, if you look at the first 36 years, they're all Virginians except for 4 years, which was John Adams. So that brings us to the the judicial branch. Now, the judicial branch, the Supreme Court is the only court mentioned in the Constitution. No other court. It says Congress can create the other courts, and they will eventually do with the Judiciary Act of 1789. They'll create district courts and appellate courts. The Supreme Court is the only court that's mentioned by the Constitution. There, judges would, or justices, they like that better, justices would be appointed by the president with the consent of the Senate and serve a lifetime term. The Supreme Court's jurisdiction would primarily be appellate. They'd hear appeals. They have some original jurisdiction based primarily on state versus state and cases involving foreign ministers, but very little original jurisdiction, meaning that there's not a lot of cases that they can hear first. And keep in mind that the Supreme Court, that number has changed. Sometimes it's been 5, it's been 6, it's been up to 10, but the tradition over the last 130 years or so has been 9. But the number does change. So that's the Constitution in a nutshell. Next up, they're going to debate the Constitution. They decide that they're going to send this out to the states, and they're going to let the states decide. Each state would hold a ratifying convention and decide if they wanted this new Constitution to go in effect. And they decide, these people at the convention, that as soon as 9 of 13 states decide to put it into action, it'll go into effect. 9 of 13, not unanimous, just 9 of 13. That's going to lead us to 2 groups, those for the Constitution and those against it.